Imagine being in a country where the promise of freedom and justice for all is a flag, but at the same time, you find yourself incarcerated in a kind of invisible prison, made of prejudice and distrust. What if, on an ordinary day, you went out on a simple errand, only to be judged and condemned before you even said a word? That's exactly what happened to a 16-year-old girl, whose only crime was being born black in a world where racism still whispers between the lines of society. It may seem absurd, but this is the reality for many. It is a shock to realize that, even though she had done nothing wrong, she was stopped, questioned, and treated as guilty. And it is precisely at this moment that you ask yourself, how long will this continue? But the story doesn't stop there. What seemed to be another sad case of discrimination took an unexpected turn when the young woman decided that she would not face this situation alone. After all, who never wishes they had someone to turn to when everything seems to fall apart? And so his father, the respected Justice John Smith, arrived on the scene, bringing with him a light of hope amidst the darkness of prejudice. What happened next is a lesson not just for the police officer who abused his power, but for all of us watching from afar, reflecting on the kind of society we want to build. Subscribe now and hit the bell to help bring more transformative content. Your participation makes all the difference. It was an ordinary day until a simple car ride turned into a nightmare for a 16-year-old girl. When she was stopped by a police officer, her life changed abruptly. Imagine being in your shoes. You were driving, following the rules, and suddenly you were stopped, not because you have committed an infraction, but simply because of your appearance and age. This disconcerting situation is more common than we would like to admit, especially in contexts where racial discrimination is still a latent reality. It is at these times that the young woman comes across a harsh and painful truth. Prejudice is still rooted in many aspects of society. The police officer, without hesitation, began to interrogate the young woman, not based on facts, but on unfounded assumptions. Her age and skin color were enough to arouse an unwarranted suspicion that something was wrong. What if it were you? It's impossible not to feel a lump in your throat when thinking about the vulnerability this situation creates. The feeling of helplessness is overwhelming. There's nothing she can do to change who she is, and yet, that seems to be the only reason she's in that uncomfortable position. As the approach unfolds, tension rises. The police officer, instead of adopting a protective and helpful stance, acts as if he were about to solve a major crime. However, what is at stake here is not public safety, but rather the dignity of a young woman who, until that moment, had done nothing wrong. It's as if the color of your skin is indisputable proof of guilt. And how can you combat preconceived judgments like this? It is an unequal fight where power is in the hands of those who should protect, but who at this moment oppresses. What we often forget is that racial discrimination is not just an individual problem, but a deeply rooted societal issue. Each incident like this reinforces harmful stereotypes and perpetuates a cycle of distrust and fear. When society fails to protect its most vulnerable members, we all lose. This young woman's case reminds us that prejudice not only affects the person directly involved, but reverberates throughout the community. The young woman, surprisingly calm, tries to cooperate as best she can, providing all the information requested. However, the police officer's suspicion does not diminish. He continues to treat her with suspicion, as if he had already decided that she was guilty of something, even without any concrete evidence. This hostile stance reflects a mentality that needs to be combated urgently. And this is where the question arises: how do we change this? How do we transform a society that still judges based on appearances? Examples of injustices based on racial profiling are countless and, unfortunately, continue to be a reality in many places. To combat this situation, a collective effort is needed, which starts with awareness. Education is one of the fundamental pillars in this process. Reading works like Becoming Black by Nusa Santos Souza can help understand the profound impact of racism on the formation of the identity of Black individuals. Additionally, participating in discussions and social movements that promote racial equality is crucial to creating meaningful change. At this point, The young woman realizes that she is facing a bigger struggle than just a misunderstanding with a police officer. She is facing a system that, in many ways, is set up to distrust her because of her color and age. This makes us reflect on the importance of having public policies that protect citizens' rights and ensure that everyone is treated fairly, regardless of their race or any other personal characteristic. This young woman's story is not unique, and that is exactly what makes it so powerful and tragic at the same time. How many other people have gone through similar situations, feeling powerless in the face of a system that was supposed to protect them? And what are we, as a society, doing to change this reality? It's a question that leads us to reflect deeply on our own prejudices and the structures that keep them alive. This situation opens space for a broader discussion about the role of security forces in society. How can we ensure that all citizens, regardless of their appearance, are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve? This is a question that must be asked, not just in crisis situations, but every day, so that we can build a more just and egalitarian society. The atmosphere began to heat up when the police officer decided to not only stop the young woman, but also launch a series of discriminatory comments. It's as if he was determined from the beginning that she was guilty, and the words that came out of his mouth only confirmed that mindset. It was not a simple routine approach. It was a clear demonstration of power and prejudice. The young woman, who until then had been trying to remain calm, felt her tension rising. Who has never been in a situation where, even though they know they are right, they feel pressured and cornered by someone in a position of authority? With each word uttered by the police officer, the hostility became more evident. He wasn't just doing his job. He was attacking the dignity of that young woman, suggesting that because she was black and young, she could not be the rightful owner of that car. This kind of assumption is devastating. And the worst thing is that, instead of being an exception, situations like this are still very common. It's sad to think that many are still judged for the simple fact of existing in a space where they are not considered normal. In this type of confrontation, the balance of power is clearly unbalanced. The young woman knew that any false move could make the situation even worse. Even so, she maintained her composure. The feeling of being on a tightrope, where any slip could result in serious consequences, is something that many have experienced. It is a harsh and raw reality for those who, due to deep-rooted prejudices, constantly need to prove their worth and innocence. With each sentence from the police officer, the provocative intention became clearer. He was not seeking the truth, but rather trying to confirm his own prejudices. The young woman, however, did not give in. She knew her only chance was to remain firm, responding with respect, even when she was not treated the same way. Here, the importance of self-control in stressful situations becomes evident. Staying calm in moments like these is not just a matter of emotional intelligence, but of survival. Instead of trying to understand the situation or approaching it with empathy, the officer chose the path of confrontation. This reveals a lot about the type of training and mentality that still persists in some police forces. When a police officer chooses confrontation over dialogue, it not only puts the safety of those involved at risk, but also erodes public trust in the institutions that are supposed to protect society. Instead of being a guardian of peace, the police officer became an agent of oppression. What happened in that interaction is a reflection of a society that still struggles to overcome its prejudices. Each of the police officer's comments was full of racist assumptions, which he himself confirmed, without any basis in real facts. This is a dangerous practice, as it reinforces stereotypes and perpetuates the cycle of distrust and violence. And, as if that weren't enough, the police officer still used his power to intimidate instead of protecting. In situations like this, where prejudice and abuse of power are so evident, it is essential that the victim has emotional and legal support. In the case of the young woman, she demonstrated admirable resilience. She knew she was being wronged, but she also knew that the best way to protect herself was to remain calm and respond clearly. This is an important lesson for everyone. In times of crisis, keeping your head on straight is crucial. But unfortunately, this is a skill that not everyone has the chance to develop before being confronted by injustice. The police officer's stance is not only a reflection of his own prejudices, but also of the lack of responsibility of institutions to properly train and supervise their agents. Situations like this should not occur, and when they do, they need to be treated seriously. Unfortunately, in many cases, institutional racism is swept under the rug, and victims are left at the mercy of a system that was not designed to protect them. The police officer's every word and action only served to increase the young woman's tension and frustration. He was not interested in resolving the situation fairly, but rather in reasserting his power and prejudice. This type of behavior is unacceptable, and society as a whole needs to take a stand against it. We cannot allow those in positions of power to use their authority to oppress and discriminate. There needs to be a change, not just in individual attitudes, but also in the structures that allow these attitudes to flourish. This confrontation, although painful and unfair, was only the beginning of a series of events that would culminate in an unexpected turn of events. As the young woman realized that the police officer would not back down, she knew she would need help to deal with the situation. And that's exactly what she did, taking us to the next chapter of this story. Faced with a situation that was becoming increasingly untenable, the young woman made the right decision: ask for help. In times like these, it's crucial to recognize when we need someone's support, especially when we face such blatant injustices. She knew that alone, her chances of getting out of that situation without harm were slim. This is when the power of the connections we cultivate throughout our lives comes into play. Knowing who to turn to in times of crisis can be the difference between despair and a solution. The young woman, with her heart racing and her mind racing, picked up her phone and called the only person who could help her at that moment: her father, Justice John Smith. This was not just any father, but a man of high standing, respected and influential. This choice, although obvious, shows how important it is to have someone in our life who can support us in critical moments. Many of us may not have a parent who is a judge, but we all have someone we trust who can offer support when we need it most. While waiting for her father, the young woman felt the weight of the situation, but she also knew that she had done what she could to protect herself. Asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but rather of intelligence. Recognizing your own limits and knowing when it's time to bring someone else into the equation is a valuable skill, especially in a world where injustices are still so prevalent. We all need to learn that we don't have to face everything alone. There are people and resources that can help us, and knowing how to access them is essential. John Smith, upon receiving the call from his daughter, immediately realized the gravity of the situation. Without hesitation, he assured her that he was on his way and that she should remain calm. This reminds us of the importance of having people in our lives who not only care about us, but who also have the ability to act on our behalf when necessary. The young woman knew that, with her father by her side, the situation would change. And that trust is something we should all cultivate in our relationships. This specific situation shows how, in times of crisis, family support can be crucial. The young woman not only had someone who could come to her rescue, but someone who had the knowledge and authority to challenge the injustice she was facing. It is a valuable lesson about the importance of building and maintaining strong family and friendship bonds. These bonds, when tested, show their true value. If there's anything we can learn from this, it's that we should value and nurture these relationships because we never know when we'll need them. While waiting, the young woman reflected on what was happening. She knew that her father was not just a judge, but a man of principle, someone who always fought for justice. Having someone like that in her life made her feel safer, even in such a desperate situation. This leads us to think about the type of people we choose to have in our lives. We need people who lift us up, who support us, and who, in the most difficult times, are by our side. John Smith was exactly that person to his daughter. However, not everyone is lucky enough to have a father who is a judge, but this story teaches us that the power of asking for help lies not just in who you know, but in recognizing when you need help. Many of us are reluctant to ask for help for fear of appearing weak or incompetent, but the truth is that knowing how to ask for help is one of the greatest strengths we can have. It takes courage to admit that we can't do it all alone, and that courage should be celebrated, not belittled. As John Smith approached the location where his daughter was, He knew he would need to use all of his knowledge and authority to correct the injustice that was being committed. And so, he prepared to face the police officer who was abusing his position. This anticipation is something we should all learn to do in our own lives. When we are faced with a crisis, we must prepare, gather our strength and resources, and then act with determination. The moment the young woman decided to call her father was a turning point. From then on, the situation would begin to change, and the power that the police officer thought he had would begin to be challenged. It reminds us that no matter how powerful the forces against us may seem, there is always something we can do to change the course of events. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is simply ask for help. The call to his father was not just a cry for help, but the beginning of a shift in the power dynamics of that situation. When John Smith arrived, he brought with him not only authority, but also the promise of justice. And with that, the young woman knew that she was no longer alone in that fight. This situation, as difficult as it was about to take an unexpected turn. When John Smith arrived at the scene, the air seemed thick with tension. He knew what he was about to do was more than just intervening in an uncomfortable situation. It was a battle against prejudice and injustice. As a judge, he was used to dealing with complicated cases, but this situation carried a different weight. It was his daughter there, being the target of blatant discrimination. It's as if all your training, all your experience has led to this moment. And he knew he would need all his composure to deal with the police officer effectively, and, at the same time, show his daughter that justice could still prevail. John approached the police officer with the calmness of someone who knows the power he has, but who also understands the importance of not abusing that power. He wasn't there to make a scene or create more tension, but to resolve the situation fairly and firmly. The first thing he did was identify himself, which immediately changed the dynamics of the interaction. The police officer, who until then had displayed an authoritarian attitude, began to realize that the situation was getting out of his control. This reminds us of how the presence of true authority can bring to light the weaknesses of those who abuse the power they have. With a firm but controlled voice, John questioned the police officer about the reason for the approach and the treatment given to his daughter. He was not only questioning the facts, but also the motives behind the officer's actions. This type of questioning is crucial in situations of injustice, as prejudices are often so deep-rooted that they go unnoticed, even by those who practice them. By confronting the officer with direct questions, John began to dismantle the false narrative he had constructed. The police officer, who had seemed so sure of himself before, began to waver. He did not expect to be confronted by someone like John Smith, someone who not only had authority, but also deeply understood the nuances of law and justice. This shift in dynamics is a powerful reminder that even in the most difficult situations, knowledge and authority can be powerful tools for turning around unjust situations. John was not there to intimidate, but to ensure that his daughter was treated with the respect and dignity that any person deserves. As John continued to confront the officer, he brought to light the racial bias that was clearly present in the situation. He did not do this in an accusatory way, but in a way that forced the officer to reflect on his own actions. People often don't realize how much they are being influenced by stereotypes until someone forces them to confront them. John was doing just that, using his knowledge and experience to open the officer's eyes to the reality of the prejudice he was perpetuating. John Smith's presence not only altered the dynamic between him and the police officer, but also gave his daughter a sense of safety and justice that she had not had until that moment. Knowing that her father was there, defending her rights, was an immense relief for her. This makes us think about the power a respectable authority figure can have in crisis situations. When someone in a position of power uses that power for good, it can completely transform a situation and, most importantly, restore faith and justice. While the officer tried to justify his actions, John remained calm and focused. He knew he didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. His presence and position already spoke for themselves. This is an important lesson. True power often lies not in brute force or intimidation, but in the ability to remain calm and use knowledge to defuse tense situations. John was showing the officer that he was not above the law, and that abusing his authority would have consequences. John Smith's intervention was a clear example of how to confront racism and injustice head-on. Not only did he defend his daughter, but he also gave the officer a lesson in what it means to be a true defender of the law. In doing so, he was showing everyone present that prejudice cannot be tolerated, and that those who practice it need to be held accountable for their actions. This type of intervention is essential to create a more fair and equal society. At the end of the conversation, it became clear to the police officer that he had underestimated both the young woman and her father. He realized that his prejudiced actions had not only been noticed, but also challenged in ways that he could not ignore. This leads us to reflect on the importance of holding those who hold power accountable and ensuring that they do not use it to oppress others. Justice cannot be just a word. It must be an active practice in all areas of society. With the situation under control, John and his daughter were ready to leave, but not before leaving a clear message. Racism will not be tolerated. John knew that this situation had been just one episode in a much larger struggle, but he was determined to continue that fight on every front he could. Her intervention not only protected her daughter that day, but also sent a powerful message that justice will always prevail as long as there are people willing to defend it. With the situation finally resolved, there remained a crucial lesson to be absorbed by everyone involved and, indirectly, by all of us who observed this story. The message that became clear in this episode is that racism is a social plague that corrodes the foundations of human coexistence and needs to be fought with all our strength. It is not something that can be ignored or treated with indifference. It is an issue that demands action and responsibility from each of us. And this responsibility goes beyond simply not being racist. It's about being actively anti-racist. The young woman, now at her father's side, understood that experience, although traumatic, had an educational value. She learned that the world can be cruel and unfair, but also that there are people willing to fight against that cruelty. The message she took with her was not one of fear, but of resistance. Resisting prejudice, oppression, and discrimination is a duty that we all have. And this resistance doesn't have to be aggressive. It can be done with firmness, knowledge, and above all, with the certainty that we are on the right side of history. John Smith, in turn, knew that this would not be the last time he would face racism, but he was prepared. The message he made clear to the police officer and his daughter was that fighting racism is not a battle that can be won in a single day. It is a constant struggle, which requires vigilance, courage, and, at times, sacrifice. But he also knew that this fight is worth it, as every small victory is a step towards a more just and equal society. The police officer, on the other hand, received a harsh but necessary lesson. He was forced to confront his own prejudices and understand that his actions have consequences. The message that remained for him is that power is not a shield against justice. On the contrary, those who have power must use it responsibly and respectfully. He learned the hard way that racism not only harms victims, but also dehumanizes perpetrators. And that at the end of the day, prejudice is a burden that none of us should bear. This story, although specific, carries a universal message. Racism has no place in a society that calls itself civilized. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in eradicating this injustice. It is not enough to just recognize that racism exists. It is necessary to act against it. Whether it's educating yourself, supporting inclusive policies, or simply being willing to confront prejudice when we see it, every little action counts. And this is a message that must resonate in all spheres of society. The final message that the young woman and her father take with them is one of hope. Hope that, despite everything, change is possible. The fight against racism is arduous and, at times, seems endless, but each act of resistance, each successful intervention, brings us a little closer to a world where skin color does not define a person's worth. And that's a message we all need to hear and repeat until it becomes a reality. Upon reflecting on this experience, the young woman realizes that her life has changed, not just because of what happened, but because of the strength she discovered in herself. The message she carries forward is that no one should be defined by the limited and prejudiced expectations of others. Everyone has the right to live free from discrimination, and it is our responsibility to ensure that this right is respected. And that's not just a lesson for her, but for all of us. John Smith, looking at his daughter, feels a mixture of pride and concern. He knows the road ahead is still long, but he also knows that together they are stronger. The message he leaves for his daughter is clear. Never let fear or hate define you. Use these experiences to strengthen yourself, to become a powerful voice against injustice. And always remember that no matter how difficult the struggle is, it is necessary and worth it. Finally, this story reminds us that the fight against racism is a collective responsibility. We cannot wait for others to do the work for us. The message here is of action, of engagement, of active involvement in building a better world. It's not an easy fight, but it's a fight we need to fight day after day. And in doing so, we honor not only the memory of those who have suffered because of racism, but also the future of those who come after us. Now that you've followed this powerful story, the question remains, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Each of us has the power to influence the world around us, whether through small daily actions or large movements of change. And the truth is that racism, this persistent wound, will only be eradicated if each of us stands up against it. Are you willing to be the difference? Are you ready to question, to challenge the status quo, to not remain silent in the face of injustice? Because what you do or don't do can impact lives in ways you never imagined. So don't let this lesson get lost. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and continue to educate yourself on how we can build a more fair and equal society together. Knowledge is the most powerful weapon against prejudice, and the more we know, the more equipped we will be to fight for a world where skin color does not determine anyone's destiny. Let's, together, be part of this change. Are you ready for this journey?